Happy Sunday, everybody, as we come to the end of Edge of Eternities and await the release of Through the Omen Paths and Marvel's Spider-Man, coming on Tuesday to Arena. I thought I would just kind of go over my favorite my top 8 favorite archetypes for Edge of Eternities, and because usually I talk about I try to remove my bias, right? And so what I want to do is just kind of talk about what I've been doing and what I've been enjoying about Best of One Standard, specifically in the last set. So first off, Best of Three is not in a really great spot, right? There's been lots of complaints about, is it Vivi? We're not even going to go there. We're just going to talk about Arena specifically, and what I've been enjoying about it, right? So I think that it's been a good set. I think it's been a fun rotation. I think that we see a good spread of the archetypes between aggro, control, and combo. So we'll kind of talk about what's going on there as well. So my number one favorite archetype for this, for Edge of Eternities, was Boros Burn. I think it was the one that I used the most often when climbing to Mythic, and it has the most favorable just kind of matchup with the whole spread of the meta. And my specific build is very similar to what we talked about during the meta review. The only change that I've made is I removed the Grease Wrench Goblin and brought in 4 copies of the Bolt Wave. And I just like it. It synergizes a little bit more with the Slickshot Show-Off, and it doesn't get blocked as readily, right? The Grease Wrench Goblin can give you some late-game dig, but the 2-1 I found just can get, gummed up on the board, whereas, you get more synergies with the Bolt Wave. So if you're completely new, I will just kind of also give you my brief mulligan strategy. I think that help pilot the deck and understand what you're looking for. So I look for the Hired Claw, the Sheltered by Ghosts. This is really the benefit of being in red-white instead of just strictly mono-red. And then I like the 4 copies of the Emberheart Challenger. If you've been following the channel throughout the weeks, you might have heard me talk about why I like this one at 4 copies, giving you that dig with the Sheltered by Ghosts, as well as just kind of another heavy hitter that has the prowess synergies like Slickshot Show-Off. And then the top end, the Screaming Nemesis, is really nice for when you're up against other mono red decks or other damage-based removal from your opponent. It's really nice to have the Screaming Nemesis, especially like when you're on the draw. It can really help you flip games into your favor. So those are the 4 that I'm looking for. And just been one of my favorite archetypes, and it was kind of fun to see too. Boros Burn was Foundations, like they tried to breathe life into the archetype, and it didn't quite get there. It never was really like in the tier 1 spot. And now that the meta's slowed down just a little bit by removing some of the busted, Monstrous Rage, Heartfire Hero, that sort of thing, Boros Burn I think is just really well positioned. Second up is Dimir Midrange. This is the one that I would use the second most often when climbing the ladder. And it has I've adapted this from a lot of like the best of 3 lists that you'll see for Dimir Midrange, and made it a little bit more geared towards best of 1. So if you will notice, like Tishana's Tidebinder is missing. While it's a nice matchup against mono green landfall or the Gruul Landfall archetypes, I think that it just doesn't fit as well against the red damage removal for Torch the Tower, Shock, Burst Lightning, that sort of thing. I just don't like it when my 3-drop trades with a 1-costed interaction from my opponent. So I've decided to drop them. And so we've dropped like a Restless Reef. Near the end, we saw like an uptick in Nowhere to Run. This is really kind of meta specific. If you want to run a full playset of Nowhere to Run, obviously it's better the more you're coming up against Snakeskin Veil and Sheltered by Ghosts, that sort of thing. I found the Shoot the Sheriff to be well positioned enough, so I've been running the Shoot the Sheriff over the Nowhere to Run, but feel free to swap those back and forth depending on what you're coming up against. Like I mentioned, Tishana's Tidebinder I dropped, and then I also dropped 1 Long Goodbye. And instead, running the full playset of Shoot the Sheriff, bringing in the 4th copy of Kaido. This one, again, depends on how much you're coming up against other aggro matchups. So if you're coming up against a lot of mono red, and we saw an uptick in mono red at the end of Edge of Eternities, you may want to drop Kaido down to 3 copies. I've been liking 4, but that's because I've been kind of bumping into a spread. The meta's been pretty diverse after rotation. It's not all dominated by aggro. You'll bump into combo control like Jeskai Artifacts or Azorius Control. So I think Kaido's okay. I've found it to work okay at 4 copies. We've seen some lists dropping the Tragic Trajectory. I really like being able to pop it, sacrifice a map token and be able to hit something for -10, -10. I think a lot of times you can trade up in value quite readily with the Tragic Trajectory. The downside is that it is sorcery speed. And then I just brought in an additional island instead of the Restless Reef. Again, it's just kind of preference on how you want to build your mana base. So, the opening hand, you're looking for Cecil, Dark Knight, Spyglass Siren, Deep Cavern Bat, Nowhere to Run, and the Phantom Interference. And Shoot the Sheriff, Nowhere to Run, sort of interchangeable. All right, now Mono Red Aggro comes in at number 3, and this one, I've decided to take more of a creature-based approach. So the lists that we were talking about in the best of 1, best of 3 meta review, we're running Bolt Wave and Witchstalker Frenzy, and having a little bit more of the burn aspect that Boros Burn is leaning into as well. But I think the real advantage of playing strictly in the red space is having access to double pip red on turn 2, which needs that 21 sources of red. So that allows us to play the Razor King Needlehead, which is harder to play in something like Boros Auras, right? And then also like the double pip on Nova Hellkite, depending on your mana base, like that one's a little bit less specific, but the real payoff is the Needlehead. And so anyway, I dropped the Rockface Villages. Part of that is because like with the 21 sources, if you go like it allows you to have the double pip red, and the Rockface Village is only for creatures. So it does have synergies with the Emberheart Challenger and the Hired Claw. I just found myself not using it very much and having moments where I had just like Rockface Villages in hand and being unable to cast like Burst Lightning, Shock, and Lightning Strike. So that one is like a little bit more of just personal preference if you want to run that one. Get to Lava Runner is one that is commonly included. It's the 2/2 haste if you have the instances and sorceries in your graveyard. What I've found is that I prefer to develop the board with threats and then play my interaction later, and where you're going to have more synergies with like the prowess in the deck. And that was the opposite of what the Lava Runner wanted you to do. It wanted you to play your interaction early and then play out the Lava Runner as a haster. So I just felt like I didn't like it, so I got rid of it. Bolt Wave, again, I'm leaning a little bit further away from the burn aspect and leaning more into creature-based threats, so I got rid of the Bolt Wave and the Witchstalker Frenzy, which you can shoot your Screaming Nemesis. My problem was that when you're playing up in Diamond and Mythic, Screaming Nemesis, people like wait for you to hit it with the Witchstalker Frenzy a little bit more. So it performs a little bit better on the lower ranks to run stuff like the Witchstalker Frenzy. It gets punished by bounce and like into the Flood Maw and shoot the Sheriff and that sort of thing if your opponent is ready for it, because it gets a 2-for-1. Okay, so the Razorkin Needlehead, what I like about this is that it pairs nicely with like Shock and Burst Lightning. A lot of the times you can deal the first strike and then finish it off with instant speed interaction. But if you're also it gives you burn in a different way that late in the game, if you're kind of stuck, you can just sit there and let your opponent draw cards and slowly dwindle, right? So it also we've seen a spike in this from best of 3 because of being able to punish the Winter Night Stories and Is It Cauldron, but I do think it fits well into the mono red archetype in best of 1. And then we have the Burnout Bastronaut is so the Burnout Bastronaut is another one that it can just get such an if you're focusing on that creature-based board presence, the menace and being able to give you that double strike once you reach max speed, Burnout Bastronaut can hit for a ton of damage later in the game. So I've just preferred it to some of the other drops like the Get to Lava Runner and the Grease Wrench Goblin. And then Nova Hellkite I think fits into this archetype better than it does into Boros Burn. Again, just being able to kind of be that creature-based threat. And then running the 4 mountains instead of the Rockface Village. And number 4, in my opinion, is Jeskai Artifacts. This one, I think some people would say is the number 1 deck to come out of Edge of Eternities. It really depends. Again, it has more about the matchups. And again, if you want to know all the matchup data, go listen to my best of 1, best of 3 meta review. But it's definitely in the top 8. I think that it's a strong deck. What I've decided to do is take out some of the islands, the Enigma Jewel that we saw being kind of explored as a one of, as well as the white planet, which has the ability to copy the artifacts and enchantments. And instead, what I'm doing is I'm bringing in the one copy of the Braided Net. We've seen some versions run like 3. What I like about the Braided Net over the Enigma Jewel is that later in the game, occasionally you will need that moment of being able to draw off of the Braided Quipu. And that's the same reason why I'm running the Uthros Titanic God Core, is it sometimes does come down later in the game. The most common thing that I've experienced later in the game is needing a surplus of mana. So being able to tap this to pop your Braided Quipu to draw a bunch of cards seems more relevant than creating copies of the Simulacrum Synthesizer, because a lot of the times that the game has gone on that long, they've destroyed the Simulacrum Synthesizer and you don't really have anything interesting to copy in the first place. So I'd much rather dig for resetting the engine up against control decks after you get like Ultimate or something like that. So we're talking very late game, very minuscule changes, honestly. So I brought in the Fabled Passage. I think that especially on turn 4, if you can kind of thin your deck, it makes the United Battlefront better. And that's another thing that I want to talk about, is that I've dropped the lands to 22. We'll see some lists running 24, and the less lands that we can have in our deck, the better the United Battlefront becomes. But that's partly why I'm running the Cryogen Relic, is that Clay-Fired Bricks and Cryogen Relic allow you to run a lower land count, while still being able to hit 4 lands on turn 4. So it's kind of, we're stretching the mana base just a little bit to make our United Battlefront a little bit better. And then, I also brought in 2 planes. And the reason why I brought in 2 planes is because I like to have 18 sources of white so that we can hit the Pinnacle Star Cage on turn 4, on turn 3, 90% of the time. So having the double pip white, I feel like running a little bit more white, less blue than the typical build, I've found to work a little bit better. So the opening hand for this one, I like the 4 copies of the Authority of the Consuls. Again, we'll see kind of through the best of 1, best of 3 meta review that some lists like to run the Authority, some don't. The more aggro that you're coming up against, the better the Authority will perform. But I like having it in the opening hand because it slows down the creature-based decks that can overrun this deck. And then against like the slower decks, I don't really mind having it be a dead card. You can kind of, it's not the end of the world if it's a dead card in that matchup, because you're really just trying to punish the single point interaction of like mono black by hitting a Simulacrum Synthesizer that they have a difficult time interacting with, and just win via that way, right? So Clay-Fired Bricks, like I mentioned, so I look for this one in my opening hand because of wanting to curve out into the hitting the United Battlefront. And then the Simulacrum Synthesizer is a nice one to have in your hand. Like, you're trying to hit it off of the United Battlefront, but turn 3 Simulacrum Synthesizer into hitting a second one on turn 4 is the dream. Number 5 is Selesnya Rabbits, and this one I really want to spend a little bit of time on because Selesnya Rabbits was probably the number 1 build prior to rotation. It was the one that was king, if you will. Maybe mono red, right? But it depends if you're talking about pre-ban or post-ban. But anyway, so Selesnya Rabbits is looking pretty strong, but I think it's kind of a forgotten deck. I think it's one that people, because it didn't bring in a lot of new cards or new strategies, I think Selesnya Rabbits kind of got left behind. And that was partly because of everybody playing Jeskai Artifacts and bringing in the Pinnacle of the Star Cage. And so what I've done is I've tweaked it to reflect that the meta is a little bit slower, that we can go a little bit higher up on the curve, and it also makes us a little bit more resilient to the Pinnacle Star Cage in the first place. So what I've dropped is 4 plains and 4 forests, as well as 2 seam rips and the 4 Burrowguard Mentors, and brought in the Cavern of Souls. Not all, I mean, this deck is actually starting to get a little diversified with the Might Caller and like the Bright Glass Gear Hulk and the Ouroboros. It's got enough here that like the Cavern of Souls isn't the perfect thing that it was in the past, but it still helps you fit the mana of what you need to hit early on. I've also brought in the full playset of the Oak Hollow Village. Some people like to run 2, some people don't like to run this at all. I really like that later in the game you can do like the hop to it and make them all into 2/2s with the Oak Hollow Village. It's just like it's enough that I like running a full playset, and I've built the lands in a way that I don't mind that this can't be used to cast non-creature spells, because the non-creature spells are white in the first place. So, and then, yeah, we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Ouroboros, and this is the one that we got in Edge of Eternities, and I've tried a couple of different builds around the Ouroboros, and you've definitely seen it being explored in, like, Selesnya Cage, Selesnya Counters, and Best of 3, and I think that it fits really well in Best of 1 in Selesnya Rabbits. So if you've forgotten about this deck, Might Caller into Phineas or Valley Quest Caller into Hop to It into Ouroboros, pumping all of them it works like War and War Leader, except for you get that like permanent +1/+1, right? And it doesn't have the offspring, and it doesn't spawn the 1/1 rabbit, so it's not exactly the same. But this is the most go wide deck in the meta right now in Best of 1, and this pumps your whole board with that. Even if they answer it the following turn, if you have 5 bodies on board, it's essentially leaving behind a 5/5 after you've played it. So anyway, check it out, give it a try, see what you think. Let me know. But the strategy is still the same, and the underlying core has still not been touched. So you're looking for your Valley Might Caller, your Phineas Ace Archer, which is particularly nice if you can play a hop to it on turn 3 and attack with the Phineas. Pop Hatch Recruit is a nice one to have in your opening hand, as well as the Valley Quest Caller. All right, number 6 is Gruul Landfall. And I've tried a couple of different strategies with this deck, and I've tried, the mono green version versus the Gruul version. I do think the Gruul version is a little bit better than the strictly green version, although the mono green version will beat this in the mirror because of the it's set to win a turn sooner, and it has a little bit less of a late game kind of situation off of the additional landfalls that the Ice-Till Explorer can give you, as well as the World Soul's Rage. So downside, like, there's pros and cons to everything, right? Gruul Landfall, the con is that it's a little bit slower than the strictly green mono green landfall. But you got the 14 sources of green, which I've talked about in my community deck. Tech is kind of like what you want to look for the 90% chance to have a green on turn 1 for your Land of War Elves or your Saw's Chocobo. So there's not a whole lot more that we can do with the mana base. We can't bring out less of this. And then we've got the 1 mountain for our World Soul's Rage, and then we've got the rest of it is just tap lands, right? And you could run like 3 Terramorphic Expanse or 3 Evolving Wilds, whatever you want to do there. So this deck is pretty streamlined, and I haven't really been able to improve it. The Mossborn Hydra, the Land of War Elves, the Tiva Lockhart, again, the more that you're playing in the lower ranks, the more that you'll be able to pop off with Tifa Lockhart. The higher up in the ladder you go, then Tifa Lockhart becomes less important than Bristly Bill, is what I've found. And then the Saw's Chocobo is another one that's really great in your opening hand. Number 7 is Azorius Control, and this one is probably the deck that's most likely to cause the most fighting about what should and shouldn't be included in the archetype. Because Azorius Control, and like any control build, the control does better the more specific the meta is. So if the meta is made up of 30% mono red, then you can build it to be really good against mono red, right? So the more diversity, the harder it is for you to build a control deck that has a decent spread of the meta. So if you go back and look at throughout the weeks in the Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review, you'll see that like we started out with Ultima when there was a lot of Jeskai Artifacts, and then we dropped out the Ultima and we brought in Kutzel's Flanker when there was a lot of Esper Mill. So you can kind of build this to be specific to whatever meta you're experiencing in the week. And what I wanted to do here was kind of just my favorite build. And it has what I've been experiencing is important to have, right? So we've got a fair amount of tools in the deck that are built out against the aggro build, and if you're coming up against a lot of control or Esper Mill, it's not going to be as good. But I've seen that kind of has died down in my experience, right? So I dropped the demolition fields. Some people are really going to like the demolition field, especially in the mirror match when you're able to like win basically off of, because like your wraths hit everything but the man lands. what I've found is that I prefer to have fewer colorless lands early on in the game, especially because the most important card that I'm trying to hit, I'd say 90% of the time, I want to be able to play No More Lies on turn 2. And if you have a Demolition Field in your hand, it's going to make it harder to do No More Lies on turn 2. Because Best of 1 tends to be a little bit more aggro heavy, there's a real price to be paid, right, for what you're adding into your deck. And we already have a lot of tap lands, right? We already have a lot of stuff that's like constricting being able to cast No More Lies early. So I dropped the Demolition Field. I also dropped the Hornlock Whale, and Hornlock Whale is something that's really good against aggro decks. And again, so this one kind of depends on like how much aggro are you experiencing, how much are you hedging for aggro in other places, right? So since I'm bringing in some of like the cheaper one-drop stuff, I decided to lean away from the Hornlock Whale. Where I'm also leaning away from Split Up, and that one's just kind of personal preference again. It does pair really nicely with the Authority of the Consuls. With this, I like the early interaction of Seam Rip and Authority of the Consuls to slow them down into Wraths that don't care if they're tapped or not. And so if you're running less of the interaction, the early interaction, then Split Up or the Pinnacle Starcage is going to work better for you because you're going to need to slow them down a turn sooner. Pros and cons to everything. I've also dropped the 4 copies of Get Lost, and that's largely because I haven't been bumping into a lot of Dimir Midrange, right? So if you're coming up against a lot more Kaido and you need a little bit more of that Planeswalker answers, then surely bring in the Get Losts. But I've felt like I can be a little bit greedy and get away from it because of everybody playing mono red and mono green landfall. And so I did bring in one Beza. I like the flexibility of this card because like it punishes the go wide. If they're going wide, it gives you that life gain stabilization. And then if you're playing against control, a lot of times you can play it in a way that you get a free card out of this, right? By drawing a card if your opponent has more cards than you. So it's not like I want a whole bunch of Beza, but like I find Beza to be good enough to include it in some circumstances. So I brought in one there. I brought in 2 additional copies of the Authority of the Consuls. Same with the Jeskai Artifacts. I just really like being able to slow my aggressive opponents down and having their creatures enter tapped, I think really affects Boros Burn and mono red aggro. So I've been running a full playset of the Authority of the Consuls. Stock up. Some people like to run this only as 2 copies. We're seeing like maybe a little decrease in the amount of people, like how many copies of stock up you're going to run. I still think it's a busted uncommon and have been running a full playset there. I brought in an additional Moraine River Regent. I think this is a nice win condition. The fact that you can play it as the Coil and Catch and then switch over to the win condition later in the game after, because like the whole point of this deck is just dig for Elspeth, like wrath the board, control the board, play Elspeth, win the game. So Moraine River Regent, you don't really need to play it as the 6/7 side. This just helps you dig for Elspeth. Most of the time, if they've had an answer for Elspeth, then it gives you an alternative win condition. Then I also dropped it. I brought in an island and a plains over those demolition fields. So again, disrupt your opponent's early plays, slow them down, wrath the board, win off of Elspeth. So we're looking for our No More Lies in the opening hand, Authority of the Consuls to slow them down. Elspeth Stormslayer is what I'm looking for as the win condition, so it's nice to have in your opening hand. And then Seam Rips and Day of Judgment. Again, you can tell this is very focused for a creature-centric strategy and has a lot of dead cards if your opponent is also playing a control deck. All right, and then the last one that I think deserves a little praise is the Orzhov Sephiroth deck. And it's one that, you know, hasn't been the most consistently talked about in my best of 1, best of 3 meta review, along with Selesnya Rabbits, but I do think that it has its role in the meta, right? I guess I meant to actually talk about the aggro combo control side of things, and I kind of forgot. So like Boros Burn is aggro, Dimir Midrange is midrange. Some people will debate that. It might be tempo to some people, but it gets over aggro and under control, which is I think what midrange is trying to do. So we've got mono red aggro, which is an aggro deck. We've got Jeskai Artifacts, which is a control combo deck. We've got Selesnya Rabbits, which is an aggro combo deck. We've got Gruul Landfall, which is an aggro combo deck. We've got Azorius Control, which is the one like control list. Okay, the second control list. It's the pure control list. The Jeskai Artifacts has that combo aspect to it. And then we have Orzhov Sephiroth. And this one is like a combo. It's a combo mid-range deck, right? You're trying to win off of the synergies of Raise the Past and ping your opponent to death. So the life stabilization helping you go over aggro and then being able to hopefully get underneath control. If they disrupt your Raise of the Past, you're kind of in trouble, right? And I think that's the weakness to this deck. But anyway, so what I've done from the stock list that we've talked about in Best of 1, Best of 3 is in the meta review, sorry, is dropped 2 copies of Shadowy Backstreet. And I just really, with there being 12 1-drops in this deck, like I just really don't like having a tap land and starting this kind of curve out on turn 2. It does give you an additional Surveil, which then helps you Raise the Past a little bit. I don't think it's been particularly huge, so I haven't been running it. I've just decided to bring in 2 additional Swamps so that we can hit the Snarling Gorehound and the Infestation Sage, as well as have that 18 sources of black so that we can access kind of doing like one CC plays. So like playing Zealot and a Sage on turn 3, that sort of thing. Having the 2 double pit black. So, which you can still get with the Surveil land, right, on turn 3. It's just, it can kind of, it can cause these like little bumps in the curve out. So again, very minuscule change, doesn't have a huge impact on the archetype. But this is a fun one, right? I think this one wins. It has a place in my heart because it's the most fun in a way, right? Because like you're surveilling all of your cards down into the graveyard and then figuring out like how to sacrifice everything, and then like there's something really satisfying about pinging your opponent to death with like 10 triggers of these like gaining 1 life and dealing 1 damage to your opponent. So anyway, you're looking for Voice of Victory. This is, I think, a really key card to getting the archetype to work. Being able to disrupt your opponent makes it so that they can't counterspell you Raise the Past. I think that's a really big part of why Voice of Victory is important. But also just the Mobilize 2 giving you those triggers off of Snarling Gorehound is fantastic. Servandum Sunstar Exemplar is my second card that I'm looking for in my opening hand, because this card, the fact that it if it dies or is put into exile, right? So either way, it feels like if your opponent is doing anything other than shuffling it into your deck with the Flood Pit's Drowner, it's going to interact with your opponent and give you that 2-for-1, right? So you want to play this in a point where you want to play it early so that you can get it up to being that 4 power, so that your opponent has to be 2-for-1 by Servandum. Snarling Gorehound is like how you get this whole deck to work. It's very important, so I look for this one in my opening hand. And then Infestation Sage has been a little bit better than the Nesting Bot, especially because of the Flyer, right? So the Flyer being able to just even chump block 1 turn against the Slick Shot Show-Off can be the difference, right, in how you win or lose a game. So the Flying token has been particularly nice, and I look for that one in my opening hand. So as always, thank you for listening to my ramblings. I know that this is not everyone's cup of tea, right? This is kind of a niche experience, but I really enjoy talking about Magic the Gathering, and I know some of you really like listening to my builds for Best of 1. So, of course, all of this is just about to change next week, so the timing is maybe not perfect, but I do like talking about it at the end of the set, what I've been doing specifically. And then, yeah, next week we'll be kind of talking about how Through the Omen Paths has affected the meta. So thanks again for being a part of the community. Thank you to my YouTube members who help support me monetarily. I do appreciate it. And yeah, I don't know what else to say other than I really appreciate being able to do this, and it's been a really great experience for the most part, right? One of the downsides is I have to deal with particularly negative comments, right? Actually, yeah, while I have you here, I know a lot of, I'm just rambling at this point, but I'm amazed at the amount of negativity that exists in Magic the Gathering and on YouTube in general. And I don't know if this is just something that like exists because it garners likes and interaction and like causes a conversation to happen, but I really appreciate that the vast majority of our community is not negative, that everyone here is really just trying to help each other out and enjoy the game. And So I just wanted to say thanks. You guys rock. All right. Take care, everybody, and I will see you all probably sometime next week. We'll see. Maybe I get around to doing my best, doing my brews for Through the Almond Paths on Tuesday. So take care. Catch you later.